Good day, my name is Ruth Illingworth. I'm a historian here in County Westmeath, and I'm standing in the Churchyard of St Etchen's Church of Ireland, Killucan in Westmeath, standing beside the grave of the Reverend Henry Ferris, curate of this parish of Killucan, victim of the Great Famine, ghost story writer. Reverend Henry Ferris was born in 1802, and after graduating from university he became a Church of Ireland curate. He worked first in County Kildare, in what was then the separate diocese of Kildare, and then in 1847 he came here to Mullingar in the diocese of Meath to continue his religious ministry. He was here for only a year before his tragic death. By the time he came here to Killucan, the Reverend Henry was becoming quite well known in literary circles as a writer of ghost stories. He wrote his stories for Dublin University magazine, a well-known publication of the time, which had been founded by the great Irish scholar Samuel Ferguson and by the lawyer and future politician Isaac Butt. The Dublin University magazine published many literary works. Most of those who wrote for it belonged to the Irish Unionist tradition, often strong supporters of the Church of Ireland, although some of them came to support the idea of Irish self-government as they became increasingly unhappy with the way Britain was governing Ireland. They were jokingly referred to as Orange Young Ireland. The Reverend Ferris, like many of those who contributed to the magazine, had a great interest in Irish language and culture, but he also had a great interest in the language and culture of Germany. He went there many times, and indeed he married a German woman. And some of the stories he wrote for the Dublin University magazine were set in Germany. For example, one is known as A High Cross at Bonn, a story of the Rhine. Another is entitled German Ghosts and Ghost Seers. Others of his stories were set in Ireland, and he seems to have had quite an influence on probably the best known ghost writer from this country of that time, Sheridan Le Fanu. Oscar Wilde's mother was also a contributor of ghost stories to the magazine and other publications of that time. And the Reverend Ferris, he didn't use his own name. He wrote under a name which looked sort of Welsh, Erwin Henrys, which was actually an anagram of his own name. Apart from the ghost stories set in Germany, there were also publications like A Night in a Haunted House, A Night with Mephistopheles, and The Ghost Within, and the rather favourite title of mine, Fire horror stories for Christmas. A few of his stories were published after his death. But he'd come here in 1847 to continue his religious ministry, and he arrived here at the time of the Great Famine. This part of Westmeath was not as badly affected as areas further west and northwest of here, but nevertheless the famine did impact on the poorest classes of society, Roman Catholic and Protestant alike. And the Reverend Ferris, like many clergy of many denominations, found himself on the front line helping those in need. Here at the church we're very close to the Royal Canal and also to the railway station, which opened just a few months after he arrived here. He would possibly have seen some of the nearly 1,500 famine emigres from the Strokestown estate in County Roscommon, who had been more or less evicted from their estate, given passage to Canada. They walked along the canal towpath through Westmeath, and he probably saw them heading along their way, may even have possibly helped give them food on their journey. 1,500 men, women and children, more than a third of whom would not make the final stop in Canada. The famine killed tens of thousands of people. Even in Westmeath, 16,000 died. But most of those who died not directly from hunger, but from diseases that were spread through dirt, through lice on bodies. There were cholera pandemics, there was typhoid, but the most common illness which was often referred to as famine fever, was the typhus, and typhus killed hundreds of thousands, probably more than any other cause during the famine. And typhus is highly infectious, and those who went to help those suffering from the illness were at enormous risk of getting the disease themselves. And very sadly, that is what happened to the Reverend Henry Ferris. In April 1848, which was actually the worst year for the famine in this part of Ireland, he contracted typhus from some of his parishioners here in the village of Killucan, and he died at the age of 46. And he is buried here beside me here in the churchyard of the place where he ministered in the last year of his life. And inside the church is a plaque which commemorates his service here and notes that he died from typhus while caring for the sick of this parish. And after his death, his German wife gave birth to a daughter, born 4 months after the Reverend Henry had been laid to rest here. And at that time there was no welfare state in Ireland. There was no child benefit, there was no sickness pay, no widows' pensions, and the income of a Church of Ireland clergyman would not have been very high at all. And so a fund was set up to help ensure that Mrs. Ferris and her child did not end up in destitution. They were helped by the Westmeath Protestant Orphans Society, but also by donations from wealthy people from the great and good of Westmeath and beyond. And every few weeks or so, the Westmeath Guardian newspaper would publish a list of those who were subscribing to the fund for Mrs. Ferris and her daughter. And the list was in order of the amount donated. So the highest in the land didn't necessarily top the list. Others who'd given more than they were up ahead of it. And one extraordinary example of this, and a sense of how well known the Reverend Ferris had become through his writings, was one week where the list of donors, about 3 or 4 names down the list, was the Duchess of Kent. Who was she? She was the mother of Queen Victoria. So she donated money to the fund here, but because others had given more than she had, she didn't actually head the list. What became of Mrs. Ferris and her daughter? Apparently a job was found for her, I think up in around Navan, working I think as a Sunday school teacher and governess. So she was cared for by the church and society. And the Great Famine was one of the great tragedies of our history, and claimed, as we know, nationwide around 1 million lives. And here we stand at the grave of one of those victims, a man who gave his life in the service of his parish and his community during the terrible events of 1848, and who now rests here in the parish in which he served, a short distance from the canal line and railway along which so many of the famine victims travelled in their search for food and work. And so we remember here today Henry Ferris, writer of ghost stories, clergyman and community worker, who gave his life in the service of his parish during the Great Famine in 1848.